Hello, this is international football commentator Derek Ray, and you're listening to the Ranks FC podcast.
Hello, Ranks Squad, and welcome to Champions League Takeaway here on Ranks FC. My name is Jack Collins, and I'll be your host as we go through the first day of the first leg of the Champions League quarterfinals. Two massive games: Real Madrid hosting Bayern Munich at the Bernabeu, and Arsenal travelling to the José Alvalade to play Sporting. Wins for Arsenal and for Bayern Munich, and I'm joined to work through it all by the one and only Mr. Dean Jones. How you doing, mate?
Hello, mate. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. Well, you got the better game tonight. I said I'd take the Arsenal game. I've been very supportive of the Gunners this season, haven't I? The tide's slightly changing on that, but we'll talk about that later because I really want to hear more about the Real Madrid game that you were watching.
Yeah, I think it's the natural place to start. Bayern winning for the first time in a long while at the Bernabeu. This has been the scene of plenty of Champions League disappointments for Bayern Munich. And I heard this described ahead of the game as the European Clasico, which I really liked. Right?
That is a good one, yeah.
Enjoyed that as a description. Two absolute giants, two teams who have such a rich tapestry of history in this competition. And I was intrigued to kind of see what Real Madrid looked like really ahead of this one, because I think it was pretty comfortable that I knew how Bayern were going to set up. And the question was going to be, after what happened at the weekend with Real Madrid and that incredible loss to Mallorca at Sant Boi, which potentially hands the title to Barcelona, that 7-point gap looks pretty unassailable at the top of La Liga. What changes Alvaro Arbeloa would make to that team? And we saw a slightly different shape to Real Madrid to what we've seen in recent weeks. He's been going with that kind of split striker system with Brahim Diaz on the right-hand side. It's been Vinicius Jr. in the weeks up to the international break. It was Kylian Mbappe at the weekend, and things didn't really go to plan. But I was also concerned about if they're taking another player out of the midfield, what it was going to look like in terms of, we know how good this Bayern side are. And so there were a couple of changes. Vinny Jr. and Kylian Mbappe both started in the forward line, with Arda Güler sort of nominally playing as a right-hand-sided attacker, drifting into the midfield to make sure. And then a midfield three of Valverde, Tchouaméni and Petarque, with Camavinga coming out from the weekend. And to be honest, it was a strange game in some ways. Now, it could have been 5-4. To either of these sides, I think. And whilst Bayern were dominant for large periods of the game, you also come out of it thinking, wow, Manuel Neuer has had an absolute stormer there in terms of how it's shaken out. You know, Real Madrid have 21 shots to Bayern's 19. There are 10 Real Madrid shots on target to Bayern's 9. You're looking at it and thinking, actually, on paper, it kind of looks like the scoreline should probably have been this close. But also watching it, it did feel like Bayern were incredibly wasteful at times. And so it's a very difficult one to kind of take a kind of snapshot of, I suppose. And obviously that's what this podcast is for us to kind of look back at the Champions League and try and give our kind of immediate thoughts on everything that's gone down. But if this game at halftime, you know, you'd said to me, how's this going to end? It could have been 5-0 Bayern. That's how brilliant they looked at times in the first half. And yet there are a couple of really big saves from Manuel Neuer, in particular in the first half, one on Kylian Mbappe. We're thinking, actually, any other keeper in the world, and maybe that goes in. But the moment that Bayern scored the second, sort of 20-odd seconds after halftime, after maybe the worst kickoff I've ever seen from Real Madrid. So they play the ball back to Alvaro Carreras, who picks it up from the left-back position. I'll talk about Carreras a bit more in detail a little bit later on. But he picks it up. He drives it out to the left-hand channel. And at that moment, he goes marauding up the pitch. Vinicius Jr. tries the ball back inside. The ball gets cut out. Bayern storm up the other end. And it's paid off for Harry Kane to score. Michael Elise just tucks it back and he puts it into the corner. And you're thinking, that might be just generally one of the most positionally unaware things I've ever from a left back who was getting torched for the entirety of these 90 minutes, if we're particularly honest. A very, very bad day at the office for Alvaro Carreras. Equally, he was coming up against Michael Olise, who I've made the claim on this podcast before. I made it on radio this week. It was clipped up. I think he's having a Ballon d'Or contender season. So things can happen when you're up against a player of Michael Olise's quality and also in Michael Olise's vein of form. But I think the kind of overall feeling coming out of it, Dean, the final whistle blew, and there was a sense of breathlessness. And when you're kind of trying to examine what the outcome looks like, at 2-0 down, Real Madrid could have capitulated, and the mood felt pretty kind of revolutionary in the Bernabeu. There were some very, very angry voices going on after that one. And Kylian Mbappe, has taken a little bit of this for a couple of the chances that were saved. Vinicius Jr. takes a lot of heat for missing an opportunity when Bayern did make a mistake of Upamecano falling over, and Vinicius runs through on goal and fires it into the side netting after going around Neuer. And the mood was angry, right? Like in the stadium, the whistles were deafening. And you're thinking, wow, this could really turn the stadium if the performance carries on like this. And from that moment onwards, you're thinking, okay, if you'd said then it could have been 5-0 to Bayern, you would have thought, okay, yeah, fair enough. A relatively reasonable way to look at the way that the game's played out. But then Real Madrid score. And there's a couple of changes that take place before that. Jude Bellingham comes onto the pitch and actually I thought had a very positive impact. But it was actually a link up between Valverde and Trent Alexander-Arnold that makes the goal. Valverde slips Alexander-Arnold in after he drives down that right-hand side. He plays an inch perfect, whipped cross along the floor. The Kylian Mbappe has to tuck away. Like there's no way. He does his very, very best to mess this up. He hits it back across goal. Neuer palms it onto the crossbar. It bounces down, hits Brahim, and it's sort of clawed out. And you're thinking, has that actually gone in? But it had done. And Kylian Mbappe will get given the goal because the ball was just about over the line before Brahim went storming into it. But it was almost as if Real Madrid at that moment went, oh yeah, we're Real Madrid and this is the Champions League. And suddenly they were the ones on the front foot. They were the ones in the ascendancy. The mood of the stadium switched like that. And when you kind of flipped it at that point, you're thinking, well, they could find an equalizer here. And if it wasn't for Manuel Neuer, they might well have done. On the flip side of that, Bayern had their opportunities late on. They were a little bit sloppy with the passing. Luis Diaz, in particular, I thought was lax in terms of having 2-on-1 opportunities, getting the pass wrong, missing the moment to lay the ball in, etc., etc., etc. So it turned into a really scintillating game of football, I thought. And at the start, you're kind of expecting, and especially, speaking to Real Madrid fans ahead of this game, ahead of the international break, I think there was a real sense of, wow, okay, we're starting to work this out. It feels like we're moving in the right direction. There's a sense of cohesion about the team. And then you watch them at the weekend in that Mallorca game, and that had completely gone out the window. So then speaking to fans yesterday and today, and hearing what they had to say, there was a real sense of trepidation, I think, about this game. They're like, Bayern, an incredibly well-drilled side. They know exactly how they're going to play. We know exactly how they're going to play, but ultimately teams have really failed to stop them, mostly over the course of this entire season. How are we going to be able to do that considering what we look like at the weekend? And I think that, on the whole, Real Madrid will probably be looking at this and being disappointed that obviously they've lost at home and they have a second leg to go to Bavaria, which looks like a very, very difficult task considering how good Bayern have been at home this year. But also, Bayern, as happy as they will be about winning at the Bernabeu, will think this tie could well be put to bed by the time we went back home. And I think after the immediate happiness of, we've kind of finished the curse, we've ended that incredibly poor spell of games at the Bernabeu in Madrid, we should be very, very pleased with our efforts and the way that we controlled the game for long spells. I think in the next couple of days, they might well end up settling into a kind of thought process that goes, we really should have put Real Madrid away because we know what they're like in this competition. And we know that when they do get that kind of lease of life, sometimes out of nowhere, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop them. So yeah. I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. Bayern with a better team deserve to win the game. Equally, have been reliant on their goalkeeper, haven't taken their chances towards the end to really kill this one off. And Real Madrid, from a position where it looked like they were kind of down and out after that goal from Harry Kane just after halftime, have somehow come out of this with a single goal deficit. And whilst they'll be looking at that as a difficult uphill task, they'll be like, actually, there was a world where we were completely out of this tie before it was, before we'd even got to the second leg. That is not the world we're now inhabiting. It's a bit of a strange one.
Yeah, it is. I mean, ultimately Bayern Munich are very good at scoring goals at home. So they're going to score in the second leg. And that means that Real Madrid have to go there and score 3 in my mind. And I don't know that this Real Madrid team has that superpower about them at the moment, especially not in the second leg away.
Weird if they had, considering those 10 shots on target.
Yeah. Bayern, 4 goals in their last home game, 4 goals in the one before that against Atalanta, 4 goals in the one before that against Gladbach, 3 in the one before that against Frankfurt. Like, got 5 against Hoffenheim. Like, this team scores goals for fun. And I know that, like, the general level of Bundesliga is not comparable to a Champions League Real Madrid side, but this isn't the best version of Real Madrid you're ever going to play. And they've still managed to come out of the Bernabeu with the lead. Now, from everything I'm hearing, like, they could have won the game 3-0 and had it done rather than be at 2-1 and have that nervousness about them. But equally, you take the win and you move forward with confidence at this point, especially as they've got Harry Kane. Like, this guy's ridiculous. Like, the number of, he's going to score over 50 goals this season. The ruthlessness of him is unbelievable, but just the variety of goals that he's scoring. I was watching the other day, there was like a compilation of all the goals he'd scored this season. He's just absolutely unbelievable. And I wish I had more faith in the rest of the England team for the World Cup, because when you see what Kane's capable of, like, he should certainly have the capability to become a World Cup winner, right? But certainly, like, this is a player that has the capability to go and win the Champions League this season. I mean, obviously, I haven't seen this game particularly yet, but he's obviously got the score sheet, and it feels like this guy's just capable of anything once he's like within 25 yards of goal.
Yeah, I mean, he very much is. And actually, the ball laid up for him by Elise there's still a lot to do. He's outside the box and he bends it beautifully into the corner. You know, Looney gets a hand to it, can't keep it out. It's a really, really good finish. And look, he's obviously being managed a little bit in terms of his minutes at the moment after coming back from a little bit of a knock. Obviously, we saw him kind of not used in the international break, which will have given him a little bit of a rest, which I think is a good thing going into this crucial stretch of the season from a club perspective. But also, I think that Thomas Tuchel's probably managed that quite well in terms of making sure that he's fit and firing for the World Cup, because ultimately, without him, there is very, very little chance, I think, of England going in and doing anything at this World Cup. But I mean, Thomas Tuchel will also be pleased about Jude Bellingham's impact. I've been really, really hot on Thiago Pitag, right? And I think that today, not the occasion felt too big for him, but it did feel like without the extra man in midfield, perhaps he was being asked to kind of lead the midfield in a way that left him a little bit exposed, and he wasn't able to have the same kind of impact. Now, he's been very, very good at recycling the ball. He's been very good at making sure that Real Madrid can control the tempo of games, I think, mostly. And I really thought they missed him in the Mallorca game at the weekend. But Jude Bellingham replaced him around the hour mark. And at that point, you know, it did feel like everything was kind of starting to fall apart for Real Madrid. They'd had moments, but the question was kind of when Bayern was scoring a third. And Bellingham started to exert a little bit of physical dominance on this midfield, which Real Madrid really needed. And you saw him start to stretch his legs and start to move with the ball and carry Real Madrid up the pitch in a way that they hadn't really done in the first half. Now, they had opportunities in the first half, but it felt like those were created by playing very quickly, very vertically, getting Kylian Mbappe or Vinicius Jr. away in the kind of channels, and then working their way in to make those changes. And actually, when Jude Bellingham came on, they started to exert a little bit more pressure in the middle of the park. And look, this is an incredibly technically gifted Bayern midfield, right? And Pavlovic and Kimmich, we know that, but also Connie Lima coming out of that right back slot and dropping in there to make the extra man, especially when they're dominant on the ball. But it did feel like Real Madrid had been technically outmatched in there. And Pitag is kind of fighting a losing battle in that regard, because whilst Tchouaméni is an absolutely phenomenal player, he was kind of managing the situation, holding as the deepest player, not given as much license to perhaps pick the passes that he has been doing when the midfield has been a four. And Fede Valverde was charging around as usual. I thought he was one of the best players on the pitch for the entire 90 minutes, which you couldn't really say for almost anyone else in a white shirt. But you kind of look at it and think, okay, who's kind of slowing it down and who's trying to play those triangles in the midfield with Petarca? And the answer was kind of no one. But that's fine, because Real Madrid's best spell in the game came when they actually moved away from that. And they realized that Bayern were going to technically outmatch them and almost went for the jugular and went, okay, we're going to try and run through you if that's the case. And sometimes you've got to be a little bit brutal, right? If you have a team, and this is obviously an incredibly talented Real Madrid side, no one's disputing that. But I think in terms of cohesion, in terms of the way that they play and the way that they knock the ball around, Bayern are such a ball dominant side with such gifted players in these areas to make those kind of small passes, to camp at the edge of a box. That's not really what Real Madrid want to do. They want to be able to kind of slice through you in a moment. And I thought that when they moved away from trying to slow the game down, which has its place, and I do think that Real Madrid need more of that at times, it felt like Bellingham's introduction really did coincide with the moment that Real Madrid just went, okay, fine, take the throttle off and we'll just go for it. And it worked because it put Bayern on the back foot. Now, it did, and I will say this, make the game into a basketball game. And if you do that at the Allianz, I do worry that Real Madrid will concede an absolute hatful and Bayern will not be as wasteful, I don't think, as they were tonight. Because as good as they were in large swathes, that end of the game, as it did open up, Bayern really didn't take the chances that they could have done to put the game to bed. But it might be Real Madrid's best bet of actually forcing this into a chaos game, because this is a team that over the last couple of years have thrived in chaos in this competition. Now, I think that's been at their detriment at times in the league. And I think that playing in chaos is sometimes a very dangerous strategy when you're coming up against a team who have a plan and can execute upon it in the way that Arsenal did to Real Madrid last year, but Bayern did for long spells tonight. But equally, I don't think that they can hang with Bayern in terms of the kind of slow the game down and knock it around. And so they might have to just go for broke here. And as we know, Real Madrid with nothing to lose, as they will do in the Bernabeu, in the Allianz, are a dangerous animal in the Champions League. But they're going to have to deal with the left-back issue. And I wanted to come on to this because Carreras had an absolute nightmare. He will be dizzy. He will be waking up in cold sweats for the next couple of weeks thinking about Michael Olise, because this was torment. And Olise is having a wonderful season, right? As I said before, a Ballon d'Or worthy season as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, you need to back that up with the trophies, but he's doing as much as he can. He doesn't get a goal tonight, but it almost felt weird that he didn't, considering how important he was to the way that Bayern attacked. He gets the assist for the Harry Kane goal, but he tied Carreras in knots. And look, there's a lot of discussion sometimes around Trent Alexander-Arnold and what he brings from a defensive perspective. I actually thought that he handled Luis Diaz okay, generally. That yes, Diaz gets in behind him for the goal, but it's Carreras that's playing him onside, and Alexander-Arnold is onside at that moment. And for almost the entire 90 minutes, Olise had him exactly where he wanted him. I was surprised that Arbeloa didn't make the change, because obviously you've got a couple of players there who can slot into that role. Fran Garcia on the bench, but we've seen Camavinga play at left back. We've seen Élber play at left back. It did feel like an absolute roast in many ways. And I do wonder what it's going to look like next time out, whether they have to change, whether they need an extra body on that left-hand side to be able to double up on Olise and stop him causing the havoc that he did tonight. But yeah, an incredible performance from Olise and a night to forget for Álvaro Carreras.
Yeah, very good. I mean, nobody wants to play against Olise at the moment, so you've got to be on it if you're going to have any chance. And it sounds like wasn't quite the case there. But one of the toughest tasks in football, so he's got to forgive himself a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one thing being asked to do that. It's another thing, I think. Real Madrid have 3 left backs on the books. And the reason is that the previous 2 in Fran Garcia and Ferland Mendy couldn't really work out if they were good enough, what they brought to the table, etc. Mendy's obviously had major injury issues. Fran Garcia was brought back to the club after a spell away. And it just feels like they haven't quite worked it out yet. Now, I think that of the 3 of them, Ferland Mendy is probably the most astute defensive pick of the three, but he's had serious injury issues and he can't seem to stay fit, out again at the moment. Fran Garcia is probably slightly more defensively minded than Carreras, but I think what they're trying to do is be like, well, if we can get Bayern going back the other way, then maybe they won't be able to attack down that side with such regularity. The problem is that Carreras kind of kept attacking, kept driving forward, left Elise to his own devices, and then is scrambling back time and time again. And even when he is back in position, he's getting skinned. So having to kind of chase up and down for the entire time is not really ideal.
Not ideal in that
perspective. So I do wonder how they address that, because if that happens again in the second leg, you'd imagine that Madrid are going to get punished down that flank again. But yeah, a tough day at the office for him.
Absolutely, mate. Well, sadly, my game wasn't as entertaining as that. So let's talk about that in the next part.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll take a little break there. When we come back on the other side, we'll be discussing Arsenal's win at Sporting. Stick with us here on Ranks FC. Welcome back to Champions League Takeaway here on Ranks FC. Jack Collins and Dean Jones with you to work through Tuesday's action in the Champions League, looking at these games between Bayern Munich and Real Madrid, which Bayern won 2-1 at the Bernabeu, and of course Arsenal breaking the losing streak, if you will, with a win as José Alvalade in Lisbon against Sporting. Dean, you watched this one. What went down?
Oh, do you like boring football matches, Jack?
Yeah, mate, I love them. Famously, I actually do enjoy this kind of thing.
You need to watch this one. Honestly, it was boring Arsenal, like genuinely. But you could also dress it up as a classic away European knockout performance that's done exactly what Arteta had planned for. Now, was there an element of luck involved? I personally think so. They rode their luck at times, and we'll talk about that. But ultimately, I can kind of understand it. This is a Sporting team that hadn't lost at home since August. There was like a 17-game win streak or something ridiculous. And obviously, Arsenal just want to be in the tie and go back to the Emirates and try to finish the job off them. I felt it was risky, like based upon the way that Arsenal have been playing, based upon the narrative that's being built about them, not just bottling all the trophies, but also playing within themselves, playing sideways and backwards. Arteta draining the life out of football matches and this talented squad that he's built. He doesn't care, does he? Like, that's what I've learned from this. He doesn't care.
Why would he care? They've just won.
What people think.
Very difficult thing to do.
This is what I'm doing. And when he was running down the touchline at the end of the game, he felt like he'd won in every sense. He'd won over everybody that he knew would have been slating him at times in this game. As I say, like, it was dull. Like, genuinely, if you were a bit tired and you'd started watching this game, there was a good chance there was spells of it where you might have fallen asleep. But ultimately, there is one man beyond Mikel Arteta that Arsenal have to thank for this win. And it's not goal scorer Kai Havertz. It's goalkeeper David Raya, right? Makes 4 saves that make sure that Sporting have not scored in this game. Makes sure that his goal is not breached. Now, when you've got a world-class goalkeeper, you do expect this of them. But equally, I think an argument comes back to, well, when you have a world-class goalkeeper, you also play them in cup finals and you make sure that you win trophies. And actually, I think while David Raya's performance here is a probably 8 or 9 out of 10 that will get a lot of talk around it, I can imagine there's going to be a narrative that comes back into this too against Arteta saying, this is why you've got him. Like, you've left him out of pretty much your biggest game of the season so far, and you lost it. This guy wouldn't have let you lose that game. So that's for another day, but I do think it's important to point out. Anyway, for today, it worked out because Raya was in goal. He kept Arsenal in the game. One of the saves, particularly in the first half, was brilliant. One in the second half was brave and, smart. And then Arteta, let's say, rolls the dice. It's not a massive gamble, but, he starts with a very conservative lineup because in midfield, he's got Rice, Zubimendi and Odegaard. And then up front, he's got Gyökeres through the middle, Trossard one side, Madueke the other. And you know you're going to get work rate out of Madueke and Trossard. And you're not going to be exposed. You're not going to be caught out. Once it gets into the last 20 minutes, then Arteta's like, okay, maybe now we go for it. And I'm sure he was working towards this in terms that the subs that he had at his disposal. He brings on Kai Havertz first. And then with 15 minutes left, brings on Max Dowman and Martinelli. And ultimately, it pays off. Obviously, recently we saw Max Dowman being a game changer very late on. This time, it was Martinelli that provided the explosiveness, providing the pass. And then Kai Havertz is the guy who's composed and smart and bang on the money.
What a touch, by the way. Like, to bring this down and poke it home. Absolutely unbelievable. Lovely ball from Martinelli. And look, I think a manager's dream is two of your substitutes combining to win a game 1-0, right? But more than that, the ball is inch perfect. The touch is absolutely magical. And the finish very, very composed, as you say.
Absolutely. Now, Sporting will feel hard done by. They looked a bit devastated, to be honest, when it happened, because I think they had the better chances. As I said, hit the bar in the first half. And then, Arsenal hit the bar too. Madueke tried to score from a corner. That hit the bar. But if at 0-0, I would have been like, well, Sporting, if I was going to give the points out here, like Sporting are getting a Sporting have edged it. Yeah, exactly. But because Arsenal scored the goal, it's hard to criticise. And this is what Arteta's kind of building. Now, the problem is, it's not always going to work. And the problem is, I don't support Arsenal, don't really care. But, the only reason I care about Arsenal is because I've bigged them up all season. Said they were going to win the quadruple. They're going to struggle to win a double. Might even struggle to win a trophy at this rate. But Arteta is killing games, mate. Like, he's sucking the life out of football at times, because Arsenal are so slow in their play and they're so happy to keep it in that back third at times. And I know it's part of his plan. I know that it's something he's building. But honestly, like, I know I keep saying it, but it's because I felt it. It was boring. There was a spell in the second half. I was like, oh my God, like, struggling here. I'm only 10, 15 minutes into the second half. I'm struggling to watch it. Where's the spark? Where's the creativity? Where's the idea? Like, even the pattern of play would have been nice at that stage of the game. But then obviously he does make the subs and the opening does eventually come. And there's the goal and there's the points. And so he doesn't care if I was bored sat here, does he? What he's got is his travelling fans going absolutely mad because they've done it. They've got the win that pretty much nobody wanted them to get, because everyone wants to laugh at Arsenal at the moment and, enjoy the spiral that they're on. But it's stopped now, as you said at the start. Like, their run of defeats is over. And let's see whether this is actually a building block. I'll be honest, I'm not convinced. He has done it tonight, and so I have to give him credit because as I say, this was the game plan. But it's not convincing for me, mate. And when I look at what's coming up and knowing that, Bournemouth at home at the weekend, I do expect them to win. Sporting's still going to be hard at home. Like, that's still going to be a hard game, but they should get through it. And then obviously you've got the Man City game to come after that, which is an extremely important game in their season. So this is, really big 4 games coming up next. And I'm intrigued to see whether Arsenal are actually bouncing back from those defeats to Southampton and Man City.
I mean, look, there's obviously always two sides of every coin, right? There's always two ways of looking at something. And look, I had this on the second screen, so I didn't watch it as closely as you did. And I completely understand, the way that it did feel very slow and painstakingly methodical at times. Equally, if you look at this midfield, and I think you're right in that it is quite a kind of conservative midfield selection, in Odegaard sort of being on the right-hand side of that, Ben White stays in that right back spot with Urian Timber out for the time being. I thought he struggled a little bit, if I'm honest, in terms of the way that Sporting kind of targeted that wing. But also, they were overrun, I thought, in the midfield against Southampton. And the fact that there was that direct through the middle approach from the Saints that's ended up knocking Arsenal out of the FA Cup was partly down to the fact that Ødegaard obviously played in there with Christian Norgard as a single pivot, and then Kai Havertz playing a little bit further up from there. And it didn't give them anywhere near enough defensive cover, and they were sort of overwhelmed in those areas. And you can see that from the fact that, Shea Charles from midfield pops up with the winner and completely loads and loads of space. Look, 17 wins in a row ahead of this one for Sporting at home. They have been absolutely sensational at the Alvalade this season. And it was never going to be as easy as some people would have had you think. There was going to be a discussion here, and a lot of people looked at that and thought, well, if you could pick one of these sides in the last 8, you're picking Sporting. And my kind of response to that was, yeah, but you got to go and beat them at home. Or at the very least, you've got to be in the game. And ultimately, that's what Arsenal have done. And as you said right at the top, in some ways, this is the perfect smash and grab away performance. Now, as you say, Raya played a big part in that. Maybe a little bit of luck played a big part of that in terms of that ball being tipped onto the crossbar, coming down and not going over the line. The whole idea of the game changes if that Maxi Araujo strike hits the back of the net. But, from an Arsenal point of view, they would look at this and be like, yeah, we've just gone to a place that no one has won. A lot of teams have fallen by the wayside at. We've had a pretty dull encounter. Yeah, we've ridden our luck at times, but we've smashed and grabbed a win in the last minute with a wonderful piece of play that's given us an advantage going back home. Now, I think your point there about the second leg being, still a very difficult task is valid. Not just because, this is a good Sporting side. Rui Borges has done a brilliant job, I think, transitioning them from the 5 at the back system that Ruben Amorim played there and bringing them into a slightly more offensive team. But the way that they played today was mostly on the counter, right? And Arsenal at home, yes, they have a lead to defend now, so they won't need to be as expansive and as explosive. But I think that the crowd at the Emirates will expect them to go and try and dominate that game. We know that Sporting have obviously had success at the Emirates before. You go back to that Europa League tie that they ended up winning on penalties where Pedro Gonçalves scored from the halfway line. This is a stadium that they know and have experienced winning in before. And I think that their game plan won't really change from here, right? They played this game on the back foot and then on the counter. And that's exactly how they will play in the second half of this game, or of this kind of matchup, is exactly what they will do at the Emirates. And they've seen that they can get some joy in those areas. And if they're a little bit more clinical, then there's no reason that they can't go there and score. I think what's interesting here is that, from an Arsenal perspective, they've basically gone back to basics. And I kind of expected Arteta to do this, right? To bring in players whose work rate was going to be important down both flanks. And to be honest, I thought that especially down the left, they got a little bit overwhelmed down there anyway. So, having players that do work back was very, very important, or that could have turned a torrent into a flood. But you also kind of look at it from the perspective of, well, what do they need here? They needed a win to stop the rot, if you will, and if you can call 2 games a rot. But I think that there was a little bit of a worry and a wobble around the Arsenal fan base in terms of what's happened in the last couple of weeks. And also coming into it and looking at it from the perspective of, okay, keep a clean sheet. And yes, as you say, you ride your luck a little bit. You utilize your incredibly brilliant goalkeeper to the best of his ability. I thought the save late on down at his near post from the flicked header might have been amongst the best of the lot, because that's the one that keeps it at 0-0 at that moment and actually ends up being the moment that allows them to go and win the game. So you keep a clean sheet, which is, the kind of bread and butter of Arteta's Arsenal, and something I think that has wobbled a little bit in recent weeks and months from such a brilliant defensive start to the campaign. You get back to controlling the midfield battle, which they did, even if it was ponderous, and you take your chances when they come, which is exactly what they did. Off the bench, they changed the game and they end up winning it. Yes, Sporting will feel hard done by. And yes, they should feel hard done by. I thought that, if you actually put it in the balance of players, we ticked into the 90th minute, they were the better side. But that doesn't really matter to Arsenal here, because they haven't been trying to win friends this season. They've been trying to win trophies. And in the last couple of weeks, if you end up with no friends and no trophies, you see how loud the noise gets. the only thing that stops that noise is
Describe yourself there, mate. No friends and no trophies.
Yeah, I mean, it very, very much does.
Don't tell us into about you, mate.
Yeah, no, it's all about
a Fulham
me.
fan sitting on his own in his little office.
Don't you start. I've got enough as it is with friends like these. Who needs enemies? But you kind of look at it from their perspective, and they will be going back to North London very, very pleased with the job that's done. Will they look at that performance and say, yeah, that's the best we've played this season? No, of course not. And actually, I think it's interesting that Arsenal have been more expansive in the Champions League. If they hadn't lost to Southampton at the weekend, I think they play this game slightly differently. And I also don't necessarily think they win, but they have done. And in terms of making sure that, that people are talking about them in a different conversation, I was worried about that game against Bournemouth from an Arsenal perspective. I still am, to be honest, because I think the Bournemouth will come at them and be like, we have nothing to lose here. We may as well go for them and see if we can get inside the heads of people in the stadium and get inside the fan base. But as much as you can criticize them for this being boring, and if it had ended 0-0, I think the hammer would have come down from a variety of different places. Yeah. Effectively, they've just executed a game plan to perfection, and there's not much you can criticize about that.
I don't know. I just think back to the version of Arsenal when they used to chant, stadiums are empty everywhere we go. And they used to be so fun, and they'd batter people, and they'd
finish second.
Yeah, but I preferred that.
But you're not an Arsenal fan.
I think what they're doing is a little bit old school, to be honest. Like it felt like a bit like watching mid-90s Champions League tonight. It felt a bit like that sort of era of football where it's about resilience, and it's about unity and togetherness. And I've said on this pod that one of the reasons I think Arsenal would be successful this season is because they are a team. I don't think there are many good teams around at the moment. My big problem for Arsenal in this competition has always been, would they get past Bayern Munich? Because I see that as their nemesis, right? Like they're going to have to, if they're going to win this trophy, they've got to beat Bayern Munich. And
again, we should probably point out they have beaten Bayern Munich this season.
Yeah, in a final.
Get to a final though. Like if Arsenal gets to a final, it's a single game, and in a single game, they've tended not to lose that many this season. Obviously, this is coming from a position where they've lost the last two games.
That is the thing, mate. That's what I mean. So now, I know earlier in the season, Arsenal were fine.
They go boring then, because I think I probably can why they try and drain the life out of this football match. I don't think it goes like this if they win against Southampton.
When I was getting behind this team, I was like, I don't know. It wasn't this quite version, and I don't. Honestly, I don't think they'll beat Bayern Munich anymore. I don't.
What do I? I don't think anyone's going to beat Bayern Munich, if I'm honest.
Yeah, well, yeah, that could probably be true. But that's bad news for Arsenal. I know it's like, if they just win the league, then that is still a successful season. I get it. But what if they don't win the league as well?
Yeah,
well,
on these things, aren't you? But ultimately, that's where they're going to be judged this season. It's the Premier League. The Champions League feels, and I think one of the reasons that Arsenal have been quite free flowing up to about the last round in this competition has been the fact that it's felt a bit like we can just go and play in the Champions League. There's not really any pressure on us. You get to this point, right? Round of 16, quarterfinals, and from here onwards. There is pressure because Arsenal, were favourites ahead of the knockout rounds. And I think that there is now a feeling of expectation that perhaps wasn't there in the Champions League at the start of this season. It's been tense and nervy. And I've said this before, but I was talking to Simon Collins, who's one of the Arsenal reporters a couple of weeks back on the radio. And he was like, the atmosphere at Champions League games at the Emirates is completely different to the atmosphere at league games, because everyone comes into the league games, they're like, oh, is this the week? And that nervousness and that tension is palpable within the stadium. I don't think that's been the case up to this point in the Champions League, but I do wonder what it will be like next week at the Emirates, because I think that there now is an expectation on Arsenal, maybe not to go and win the competition, but to get through this tie. And then, you get to a semi-final and suddenly you're in a semi-final and, everything's on the line. You're 3 games away from winning a trophy that Arsenal have never won before. And they can, stop Chelsea singing only team in London with a European Cup. The pressure builds as you get deeper in the competition. And Arsenal's natural reaction to pressure, I think, under Arteta is to shell up, is to actually try to drain games out, because they know that they're effective in the kind of fine margins areas of games. And that's, I think, what happened here today. But again, I go back to it. If you open up and Sporting win 3-0, as they have done against a variety of very good teams at the Alvalade this season, they've had really, really good home performances. If that happens, Arteta is criticised, as he was against Southampton, for leaving the game too open.
Yeah,
it's a bit of a lose-lose.
I understand, and look, he's a very good football manager, and I know that people have their problems with him. But look, Arteta's obviously extremely good at what he does. The problem is there is a chance. This shouldn't happen because they should still win the league. But there is a chance that Arsenal still end up empty-handed this season, which would be preposterous for considering the position of strength that they were in. I was with somebody yesterday who said, hot take coming in, by the way, Arsenal ending this season empty-handed would be worse than Tottenham being relegated to the Championship. And I was like, do you know what? That's not... I don't know that I necessarily agree, because like being relegated to the Championship as Tottenham is crazy. But from the position they were in to end up with nothing, to be fair, isn't far away from that.
No, I agree. And I think it would be one of those things that would just be, it would never be forgotten by anybody else. And that's the thing Arsenal are battling against here. In the same way that Spurs being relegated would never
Spurs would bounce back in a year. Like, to get over this would actually probably take longer.
Yeah, it might do. It might do. And look, it's a strange situation because, we saw it with Inter last year, right? They, were favourites to go and win the league. They got to a Champions League final. They were looking pretty good in the Copa at one point. And, in the space of a month, they went from potentially being on for a treble to winning absolutely nothing. It can happen. There are cautionary tales of this, especially when you spread yourself too thin. This is a big month, as you say, for Arsenal and making sure that the same doesn't happen to them. They got over the line today. Yeah. And ultimately, that's all they would have set out to do, a difficult place to go. And neutrals won't have loved it. Pretty much no one who watched it who wasn't an Arsenal fan would have loved it. But I tell you what, if you were an Arsenal fan and that goal went in, I imagine the absolute scenes of relief were unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everyone who was there for sure is having a good time as we've been recording this. But there we go, mate. That's football. We talked about the brilliant game that you've watched, and Bayern have come out on top. Well, my game wasn't as entertaining, but Arsenal have still come out on top in the sense that Bayern have. Like, it all counts the same, right?
Yeah, 100%. And with no away goals rule in place, like those goals are those two results are exactly the same going into home legs. And I think we'll use that to pull this to a close. Champions League takeaway will be back tomorrow, although you will only have me because Dean is on a flight over the Atlantic back to San Diego. So solo mission coming in tomorrow. But for now, all that's left for me to do is say thank you very much to Mr. Dean Jones.
Cheers, mate.
I've been Jack Collins. This has been Champions League takeaway here on Ranks FC. We hope you've enjoyed this little rundown of the Tuesday night first games, the first legs of those quarterfinals. 2 more to come tomorrow. We're excited to see what the rest of the field looks like. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all very shortly, Rank Squad. Take it easy. Peace.